The millionaire's son never walked until he saw the nanny do something miraculous. Inside the cold silence of a vast mansion, the grandeur no longer carries the warmth of a home. Laughter had vanished long ago, leaving behind dust-covered walls and empty corridors. There lives Edward Hartman, once a celebrated architect whose designs bore the mark of brilliance, now reduced to a shadow wandering through the very house he created. After his wife's death, Edward Hartman was no longer himself. The man once praised as a master of architecture, known for bringing visions to life through breathtaking buildings, now lived like an empty shell. He had once stood on stages at prestigious universities, been invited to international conferences, and handled projects that most architects could only dream of. But all of that was now nothing more than faded photographs in frames, hanging on the cold walls of his mansion. The sudden loss of his wife had not only stolen happiness, but also drained Edward's will to live. Slowly, he refused to meet friends, stopped accepting new projects, and cut ties with colleagues. Letters, phone calls, and invitations continued to arrive, yet he never responded. Day after day, Edward locked himself inside his study, with only the desk lamp casting light over piles of abandoned sketches, ghosts of a past life. But the weight of his sorrow grew heavier because of Daniel, his only child, his only hope. In that tragic accident, Daniel had survived, but the boy seemed lost to the world. Sitting motionless in his wheelchair, his eyes were empty, devoid of expression. He did not speak, did not react, as if no longer connected to life. Edward tried everything. He hired the best doctors, sought out famous therapists, even paid foreign specialists. Caretakers came and went, 9 in a single year. All of them left or were dismissed. None could make Daniel speak or move. Not a single one. Each failure pushed Edward deeper into isolation. He began to believe that fate had sealed his son's condition, that Daniel would never return, and that the blame rested on his shoulders alone. The accident replayed in his mind endlessly. The blinding light, the sound of metal crashing, the piercing scream, then darkness. He never shared the details with anyone, but deep inside, Edward believed he was the cause of it all. The mansion, once a place of joy, became a prison of memories. Grand rooms gathered dust, walls echoed with the past. Staff moved quietly, fearful of making noise. No music was played, no laughter allowed. Even the smallest sign of joy felt like salt on Edward's unhealed wound. Within that atmosphere, Daniel sat for hours, sometimes days, in the same spot. Edward often passed by, glancing at his son with eyes heavy with guilt, but rarely dared to come closer. The distance between father and son widened each day. Edward feared looking into Daniel's lifeless eyes, for in them he saw his own failure reflected back. And so the house, once alive with laughter, warm dinners, and piano melodies played by his wife, was now filled only with silence. A silence not of peace, but of emptiness, gnawing at the soul. Deep down, Edward knew he was losing everything, but he also believed no one could ever bring Daniel back. For him, hope had long since died. In the midst of endless grief, Edward slowly came to see himself as the cause of it all. Yet there was one truth he could not escape. The one who bore the greatest weight of the accident was not him, but Daniel. The boy who had once been full of life, the very reason Edward had kept moving forward, had now become only a shadow within the house. To understand the depth of Edward's despair, one must look closer at Daniel's condition, his only son. Daniel Hartman, 12 years old, sat motionless in his wheelchair positioned in the corner of the vast living room. To outsiders, he resembled a statue, silent, unresponsive, his vacant eyes staring through everything. But to Edward, every glance at his son felt like thousands of knives piercing his heart. Since the accident, Daniel had not spoken a single word. He had once been a lively boy, running through the garden, listening to his mother play the piano, and endlessly asking his father questions about architectural drawings. Now every sound from Daniel had vanished. The vibrancy that once radiated from him had become nothing more than memory. Doctors once expressed hope that therapy, psychological support, speech training, physical rehabilitation might bring Daniel back. But months turned into years with no change. Specialists came and went, leaving behind only cold explanations. He doesn't want to communicate. The psychological trauma may be too deep. There's nothing more we can do. Even the household staff learned to avoid him. They set meal trays beside his wheelchair, cleaned around him carefully, but never tried to start a conversation. Too many attempts had been met with silence. Over time, Daniel became a shadow in his own home. Life inside the Hartman mansion seemed frozen in time. But on a gray afternoon, as faint rays of sunlight slipped through the tall windows, the heavy iron gates opened, and a woman stepped inside. Clara Reyes. Her name carried no glamour, no titles, no prestige. She was simply an ordinary woman, her hands accustomed to holding brooms and dusting shelves, her eyes carrying a quiet sorrow. Clara was unlike any of the caretakers who had come before. Standing before Edward during their first meeting, she did not say much, nor did she demand too many details. Her voice was soft but steady. Instead of boasting about her experience or presenting elaborate plans, she merely nodded and accepted the job. That calmness surprised Edward. He had grown used to people who arrived with promises only to leave behind disappointment. But there was something different about Clara. On her first day, Clara did not try to reach Daniel with loud chatter or awkward exercises. She simply stepped quietly into his room, observing the boy sitting motionless in his wheelchair. Rather than viewing him as a patient, she greeted him with a simple nod, as if he were just another person present in the room. Then she went about her tasks, cleaning the bookshelves, arranging objects, opening the window to let in the light. Clara carried a past few knew about. She had once cared for her younger sister with autism for many years, learning to notice the smallest signals, to practice patience and understanding in a world of silence. Perhaps that was what set her apart. She saw details others ignored. A blink when the door opened, a finger twitching at a sudden sound. To others, these were meaningless reflexes. To Clara, they were small doors leading to Daniel's hidden world. In the first days, Clara's presence seemed to make no difference. Daniel still sat silently in his wheelchair, his eyes vacant, his hands resting motionless on his lap. Edward, watching from a distance, believed it would all end like before. The caretaker would arrive with hope and eventually leave with disappointment. But Clara was not discouraged. She did not force Daniel to speak, nor did she try loud games to provoke a reaction. Instead, she chose to simply be present. While tidying the room, Clara softly hummed an old melody, a lullaby she used to sing to her younger sister through sleepless nights. Her voice was gentle like a breeze, not meant as a performance, but as a habit carved deep into her being. And then something small yet extraordinary happened. As Clara sang, Daniel's eyes slowly closed. Not out of exhaustion, but because his body seemed soothed. The tension in his muscles eased, his breathing grew steadier. Clara glanced at him briefly, showing no outward surprise, continuing her work as though nothing had happened. Yet inside, her heart trembled. For the first time, she had seen Daniel truly relax. In the days that followed, Clara began to notice more. When she opened the window, Daniel blinked harder. When a glass touched the table with a faint clink, his fingers twitched. When birds sang in the garden, his eyes shifted toward the sound. Small details everyone else had ignored now revealed themselves clearly to her. Edward noticed too, though he kept telling himself it was coincidence. Each time he caught a reaction, he turned away, afraid that hope might flare up only to die again. But Clara saw it differently. To her, these were not accidents. They were the first sparks of a door slowly opening. Clara continued to sit near Daniel, telling him ordinary stories. An elderly woman at the market each morning, a child running down the street, a little bookshop filled with the scent of old paper. She spoke in a gentle tone, as if certain Daniel was listening. And it seemed that his eyes did follow her movements, brief moments that convinced Clara he was still there, merely locked behind invisible walls. This patience began to breathe something new into the heavy air of the house. The staff started speaking in normal tones again, no longer tiptoeing through the halls. The mansion felt less suffocating, as though Daniel's very breath was returning piece by piece, carried through Clara's quiet presence. Those small changes were like underground streams seeping into the heavy air of the Hartman mansion. For Edward, they were fleeting, not enough to earn his trust. But for Clara, they were the foundation of a long journey. Day by day, she patiently built an invisible bridge between Daniel and the world. Clara began bringing small books with her. She didn't place them on the table as decoration, but gently set them on Daniel's lap. At first, he showed no reaction, his hands unmoving. But gradually, she noticed his eyes lingering longer on the covers. Once, as she dusted nearby, his fingertip brushed against the raised lines on the book's surface. It was the tiniest of gestures, but for Clara, it was enough to keep her smiling the entire day. Music slowly became another bridge. Clara often played soft piano pieces while cleaning. At first, Daniel sat motionless. But after weeks, his eyes began following her movements around the room. The notes seemed to awaken distant memories, memories of his mother sitting at the piano. Clara never mentioned it, but deep inside, she knew Daniel was still listening, still feeling. Throughout it all, Edward often stood at a distance, silent. He watched Clara repeat what seemed like pointless actions with endless patience. Inside him, two feelings collided. Part of him wanted to believe something was changing. The other part burned with shame and jealousy. Clara, a simple woman with no titles, no reputation, was doing what he, with all his wealth and connections, had failed to do. Many nights, Edward asked himself why. Why had he, the father who once swore to protect Daniel, given up so easily? While a stranger could persist with such quiet strength? The question weighed heavily, leaving him both grateful and painfully aware of his own shortcomings. Clara, however, never saw herself as remarkable. She only followed what her heart told her, to sit beside Daniel so that silence was no longer a burden, but a safe space. She believed that as long as he felt he wasn't abandoned, one day Daniel would step out from behind the invisible walls surrounding him. One quiet afternoon, Clara carried a small flashlight, not for an experiment, but out of old habit, checking the dark corners of the room. When the thin beam shone across the floor, Daniel's eyes unexpectedly followed the light. Clara paused, held the beam still, then shifted it slightly. Again, Daniel's eyes moved with it. Her heart pounded, but she pretended not to notice, continuing her chores as usual. That evening, when everyone else had left the room, Clara tried again. Sitting near Daniel, she swept the soft light across the floor. Once more, his gaze tracked the glow. This time, Clara knew for certain it was no random reflex. Beneath the shell of silence, Daniel was still there, watching, listening. In the following days, Clara tested other gentle stimuli. Birdsong, the clink of glass, a colorful ball rolling across the floor. Each time she noticed subtle reactions, a finger twitch, quicker blinks, a sharper breath. She recorded everything in a small notebook, as if gathering evidence to prove Daniel had never truly disappeared. Then, one morning, while Clara told a light-hearted story about her sister and a small dog, the impossible happened. Mid-sentence, she heard a faint sound. At first, she thought she imagined it, but when she stopped speaking, Daniel parted his lips and formed a shaky syllable. Ah. It was weak, trembling, but real. Clara held back her emotions, not cheering, only smiling gently and continuing her story, careful not to pressure him. In the days that followed, Daniel repeated the effort, sometimes va, sometimes ma. They were not full words, but for a child who had been silent for years, it was nothing short of a miracle. For the first time, something cracked through the wall of silence. One afternoon, while Clara was folding blankets, Daniel fixed his gaze on her. His lips quivered before softly uttering, Mama? Clara froze, her body stiffening as tears welled in her eyes. She didn't let them fall. Instead, she sat down, took Daniel's hand, and smiled tenderly. Perhaps he had confused her with the memory of his mother. Yet, whatever the reason, it was still the first word he had spoken aloud. From the doorway, Edward witnessed the moment. His heart shattered. Joy at hearing his son's voice mingled with painful jealousy. Daniel had called a stranger mother, while he, the father, had never received such a response. Silently, Edward turned away, leaving Clara by Daniel's side, overwhelmed with both tears and hope. After the afternoon when Daniel whispered Mama, Clara began to notice more details around the house. She felt there was something unspoken, a hidden truth lurking behind Edward's silence and the long shadow of Daniel's despair. One day, while tidying Edward's study, Clara stumbled upon a small wooden box locked away in a drawer. Inside were several pill bottles, each labeled with Daniel's name. What shocked her was the dosage and ingredients. These were not vitamins or mild supplements, but heavy sedatives, strong enough to keep a child in a constant fog. The name Dr. Elias Morton appeared repeatedly on the labels. Clara had never heard of him before. She snapped photos of the bottles and kept them secret. That night, once the house was quiet, she searched online, digging through every trace of information she could find. The deeper she read, the colder her heart grew. Dr. Morton had once been investigated for questionable prescriptions, his license revoked, yet somehow he resurfaced in hidden underground lists for desperate families. Clara sat frozen for hours, staring at the glowing screen. Now it all made sense. Daniel's vacant state was not solely the result of trauma, but also of being forced to take these powerful drugs. His silence wasn't just an aftermath of the accident, it was being manufactured. The next day, Clara said nothing to Edward. She knew that if she confronted him too soon, he might explode in anger or dismiss her entirely. But in her heart, a decision was already forming. She could not allow Daniel to live this way any longer. Each pill, each bottle, was like an invisible shackle binding an innocent child. Clara knew she was about to step into a battle, not only against Edward's stubbornness, but also against the haunting guilt that consumed him. And so, the veil covering Daniel's life began to lift. This truth did not only shake Clara, it signaled that great upheaval was about to descend upon the mansion, a place long accustomed to silence. The next morning, Clara brought the box to Edward. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "Mr. Edward, you need to see the truth." Edward glanced at the bottles, then froze. As Clara laid out the research she had gathered, his face went pale. He sank into his chair, hands gripping his head. "No, I only wanted to help my son. Morton said these would keep Daniel calm. I didn't know." His voice broke, each word cutting deeper than the last. Tears streamed down the face that had long hidden behind cold composure. This was the breaking point, the moment Edward's armor, worn for years, was finally torn apart. Clara placed her hand firmly on the desk. "These medicines aren't healing Daniel, they're imprisoning him. If you continue, you'll lose him forever." Silence filled the room. Edward bowed his head, shoulders trembling, as though the whole house had collapsed onto him. After what felt like an eternity, he lifted his eyes, red but resolute. "Stop. We stop the medication. Today." Those words were more than a medical decision. They were Edward's surrender, an admission of fear, guilt, and at last, hope. Stopping the medication did not bring instant results. In the first days, Daniel was weary, his gaze drifting, his body heavy, as though he had just awoken from an endless sleep. Clara stayed by his side hour after hour, patiently soothing him, speaking softly, humming as she always had. Edward sat quietly in the corner, caught between hope and fear. Then one morning, as sunlight poured through the window, something small yet miraculous happened. Daniel turned his head toward the sound of birds in the garden. For the first time in years, his eyes were not vacant. They lit up, following movement, as if truly seeing. Clara raised her hand and waved gently, and he blinked in response. It was simple, but for her, it was a triumph. From that day on, small changes came, one after another. Daniel laughed at one of Clara's funny stories. He reached out to touch the colorful ball she rolled toward him. Sometimes he tilted his head, listening intently to piano music, his lips moving as though trying to hum along. Then one afternoon, as Clara sat beside him telling a story, Daniel suddenly reached out and hugged her. The embrace was awkward, trembling, but real. Clara froze, tears spilling from her eyes, before wrapping him tightly in her arms, her heart trembling with indescribable joy. It wasn't just instinct. It was a clear signal that Daniel had begun to open the door to the world. Edward watched from a distance. For years he had dreamed of a moment when his son could express affection, and now it came, because of a woman he had once dismissed as merely a housemaid. He stepped closer, his voice breaking. "Clara, thank you." These were not polite words, but gratitude from the depths of his heart. For the first time, Edward admitted that Clara had saved his son, and him as well. One summer night, dark clouds gathered, wrapping the Hartman mansion in a heavy gloom. The storm arrived faster than expected. Wind howled, rain slammed against the windows, thunder shook the walls. The lights flickered, then went out, leaving the house in darkness. In that moment, Daniel panicked. Sitting in his wheelchair near the hall, his body trembled, and a scream burst from his lips. It was a sound Edward had not heard since the accident. Stunned, he rushed toward his son, but his trembling hands only made Daniel more frightened. Clara hurried in, holding a candle. Without a word, she knelt beside Daniel, set the flame on a nearby table, and wrapped her arms around the boy. He thrashed and cried, his body rigid, but Clara did not restrain him with force. She held him with tenderness, her voice rising, low and steady, softly humming a lullaby. It was the same lullaby she once sang to her younger sister on sleepless nights, now echoing through the darkened house. The melody slipped between the sound of rain and thunder, gently overpowering the storm outside. Slowly, Daniel stopped fighting. His sobs softened, turning into short gasps, then into uneven breaths. His head sank onto Clara's shoulder, his small hands gripping her shirt as though it were the only safe place left in the world. Edward stood a few steps away, his eyes brimming with tears. He had never seen his son respond like this, not to him, not to anyone, only to Clara. His heart ached with helplessness and awe. He sank into a nearby chair, silently watching as Clara's voice soothed not only his child, but also something long broken within himself. The storm outside still raged, but inside the room a strange peace was reborn. At last Daniel drifted into sleep in Clara's arms, his breathing calm and steady. The candlelight glowed warmly across his face. Clara lifted her eyes toward Edward, saying nothing, only giving a small nod. In that glance lay a vow. I am here. I will not abandon this boy. The next morning, the mansion carried a different silence, no longer heavy, but expectant. Daniel woke with clearer eyes, as if the storm had washed away some of his fear. For Edward, it was the first time in years he saw a trace of determination in his son's gaze. Clara remained close, her presence steady, as though preparing him for something greater. By that afternoon, as the sun tilted across the living room, the unthinkable began to unfold. Daniel sat in his wheelchair, staring at a notebook that had fallen just a few steps away. His eyes flickered with inner struggle, wanting to reach it, yet frozen by fear. Clara, entering the room, caught that look. She walked over, kneeling so her eyes met his. Her voice was warm but steady. "Daniel, you can stand. I believe in you." Daniel trembled, his hands gripping the armrests. His breathing grew rapid, his face flushed with strain. His frail legs quivered as though resisting the weight of the world. Clara whispered, each word like a thread of strength. "Slowly, I'm right here." And then, as if by miracle, the boy began to lift himself. His knees shook violently, but at last Daniel stood upright, his eyes widening in disbelief at himself. Clara held her breath, tears brimming, but let him balance on his own. A deep breath. Then that small foot lifted. One step, wavering, then another. Each movement unsteady, yet they were real steps, the first in years once thought impossible. At the doorway, Edward stood frozen. His heart pounded, fists clenched. He had heard every doctor say, "He will never walk again." And now, before his eyes, his son was walking. He could no longer hold back. His vision blurred with tears, his body trembling. As Daniel took a few more steps, Edward collapsed, covering his face, and sobbed aloud. His cries poured out like a flood, breaking open after years buried under guilt and despair. Clara lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes. No words were needed. In that moment, only one truth existed. A miracle had happened, born from a seed of belief planted in a child's heart. The news came unexpectedly on a quiet morning. Clara received a call from a renowned children's therapy center. They invited her to join their team, a job she had once dreamed of, advanced training, the chance to help many children like Daniel. It was an opportunity she had never dared to imagine would come true. But joy quickly turned into burden. From that day, Clara began keeping her distance. She still cared for Daniel faithfully, but the playful moments, the warm conversations, grew fewer. Her smile carried a trace of absence. Daniel was the first to notice. One evening, as Clara stood to leave, he grabbed her sleeve, his eyes trembling. "Don't go. Please don't go, Mama Clara." Clara froze. Her heart ached at hearing those words, "Mama Clara," from his trembling lips. She held him tightly, tears falling onto his shoulder. That night, Clara decided she had to tell Edward the truth. In the quiet kitchen, she hesitated, then confessed, "Mr. Edward, I received a job offer from a therapy center. It's a big opportunity for me. I don't know if I should stay or leave." Edward stood still, his heart tightening. He didn't answer right away. After Clara left, he sat alone in his study, sifting through old keepsakes. In a drawer, he found a letter from his late wife, written years ago. "If one day I am no longer here, please let others love Daniel. He needs more than one heart. Don't keep him in loneliness, or he will wither." The words cut deep, but also gave him clarity. The next evening he sought Clara out, his voice rough but firm. "Clara, I know you have dreams, and I would never hold you back. But Daniel needs you. And so do I. You are no longer just an employee. If you stay, stay as part of this family." Clara stood frozen, her eyes blurred with tears. She looked into Edward's face, the once distant man, now trembling at the thought of losing the hope he had just regained. After a moment of silence, she nodded, smiling through her tears, bittersweet yet resolute. She chose to stay, not only for the work, but for the love that had bound them together as a true family. 2 years had passed, and the Hartman mansion was no longer the same. Once a place of shadows and silence, it now brimmed with laughter and music. Daniel's drawings hung on the walls, Clara's chair stood permanently at the dining table, and the garden had become the heart of their shared life. Daniel was no longer the quiet boy in a wheelchair. He could walk now, sometimes even run clumsily down the halls. His bright laughter echoed through the house, carrying a happiness Edward once thought he had lost forever. Each time, Daniel threw his arms around Clara and cried, "Mama Clara!" Edward's eyes shone with gratitude and awe. The bond between the three had deepened day by day, unspoken yet undeniable. They were a family. Clara was no longer the maid. She was the one who had saved Daniel, who had steadied Edward, who had given the mansion its soul back. One autumn afternoon, with golden leaves carpeting the path, Edward stopped by the wooden bench in the garden. Clara and Daniel were arranging the leaves into the shape of a heart. Watching them, Edward felt emotions swell inside him. Everything he had once lost seemed to be returning in the form of a new family. He stepped closer, watching Clara's laughter as she arranged leaves with Daniel. For a moment, Edward saw not only Clara, but the echo of his late wife's dream. A warm home, filled with joy. His throat tightened, yet he forced the words out, trembling but certain. "Clara, these past 2 years, you've given Daniel and me more than a miracle. You've given us life again. I don't want to just say thank you anymore. I want, if you will allow it, for us to be a family, not just today, but for the rest of our lives." Clara looked up, eyes brimming with tears. Edward did not kneel, nor did he hold a glittering diamond. Only his trembling hands offered with pure honesty. Daniel, standing beside them, burst out with innocent excitement. "Say yes, Mama, then we'll be a real family." That pure laughter made Clara cry. She nodded, pulling both father and son into her arms. No grand gestures, no elaborate rituals, only love and trust, built day by day. A few months later, the wedding was held in the mansion's garden. Simple, warm, attended only by close friends and the household staff. White flowers lined the path, the golden sunlight bathed the scene, and laughter filled the air. Clara wore a modest dress, Edward a neat suit, while Daniel scattered petals with a face more radiant than anyone's. As Edward held Clara's hand and spoke his vows, his eyes shone with a faith he had never known before. Clara smiled, tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks. The three of them stood together amid applause and cheers, as if they had finally reclaimed the most precious gift, a true home. The Hartman mansion, once a place of grief and echoes, had become a house alive with laughter. And within it a new family was born, simple, sincere, yet utterly complete.